A Conversation with John Conenna is sponsored in part by Venus Travel Incorporated in Chicago, the agency that has served the Chicagoland area for over 55 years, which is still owned and operated since 1968 by the Conenna family. Again, Venus Travel, the premier agency for over 55 years, is a proud sponsor of A Conversation with John Conenna. And now, on to our episode. Good morning and welcome to another edition of A Conversation with John Conenna. Today we are proud and honored to have on legendary columnist and author Ron Rapoport, columnist of the Chicago Sun-Times and the Los Angeles Daily News and the Los Angeles Times and Associated Press in New York and in San Francisco. Ron is a recipient of the Ring Lardner Award, Excellence in Sports Journalism. Today we are going to talk about one of his books, but he has written many books. We have the immortal Bobby Jones book, Tim and Tom, Betty Garrett, March Madness, How March Madness Became Madness, Love in the NBA, See How She Runs, Marion Jones, Chicago, the City, an Urban Spotlight. But before I introduce Ron, we are going to talk about a book that has touched my heart, because this man was my first idol in Chicago in the ill-fated season of 1969. It's called Let's Play To, the great book that Ron wrote about. And we're going to get into this book. And of course, Mr. Banks, the legendary Chicago Cub, Mr. Cub. But first of all, before we do that, Mr. Ron Rapoport, how's it going, young man?
All is well. John, it's great to be with you. Thanks for that nice introduction. I appreciate it.
You got it. Ron, in the sense of the book, and of course, you've done so many things as I open this up here today, but I do have the book by Enright, and I also read the book by Rogers, but this book that you wrote tells the story of Mr. Ernie Banks, right down to the thing, right from his days in Dallas to the end of his career, to the end of his life. So how does it start for you, and why Ernie Banks, and how did you get involved with this?
Well, it's interesting. I came to Chicago to start writing a sports column for the Sun-Times the day that Ernie was elected to the Hall of Fame.
Oh,
Just happened to be there then. I missed his entire playing career. I don't think I ever saw him play. I grew up in Detroit. We were an American League town, so and of course the Cubs were never in the postseason. So Ernie was more of a name. He was more of a legend of being Ernie Banks, being Mr. Cub, being It's a Beautiful Day for a Ball Game, must be too. Always sunny, always optimistic, always fun to be around. I had the opportunity of sitting with him a number of years at the Cubs conventions, John. In January, when Cub fans would come in from all over the state to listen to people talk, and the players and the front office about how this year was going to be better. And I would sit with Ernie in a room that they set aside for players and scouts and the media and families and that sort of thing. And Ernie would always sit in the same spot, the same table, the same chair. And I would sit with him with no agenda. I did realize that I had been in Chicago all these years and I'd never really spent any time with Ernie Banks. And John, it got to be sort of a ritual. I'd sit down next to him and he would be Ernie. How are you? It's a beautiful day for a ball game. Kids would come up and ask for autographs. He'd ask 9-year-old boys, are you married yet? That kind of thing. Ernie, I call it Ernie being Ernie. The Ernie Banks we all know and love. But John, after 3 or 4 years of doing this, it got to the point where I could set my clock, set my watch. And after 20 minutes, all of a sudden, his voice would lower, the humor would be gone, people would sort of disappear, and we would talk about serious things. Now, to this day, I can't tell you what it is we talked about, but it was a different look at him, and I would walk away thinking, wow, this is really interesting. Ernie Banks is a real guy inside there. What a surprise. And then I thought, well, why would it be a surprise? Of course, nobody could be Ernie being Ernie all that time. There had to be a real guy inside there. And I became fascinated by the Ernie Banks we didn't know. And I said to him after the fourth or fifth, I'm giving you the long version of this. We
Sure,
have
sure.
time. After the fourth or fifth time that I would sit with him and see this manifestation, see this Ernie disappear into a quieter, more thoughtful guy, I would say to him, you know, Ernie, you ought to write a book. And he said, well, as a matter of fact, I was going to, and I had a contract with another writer. The writer had died. Then he looked at me and said, do you want it? Well, as luck would have it, he was spending most of his time in California then, and I was retiring from the Sun Times, and I was moving to Southern California, where I'd worked a couple of times. So we'd get together at his house in the marina near the ocean. I lived in the valley about 30 minutes away, or as we say in California, right around the corner.
Right around the corner.
And I would sit with him and we would talk and we would have lovely conversations, both at his house and at a, at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, sitting outside where the people would walk by. And so some of my tapes would have people walking by and waitresses taking drinks and so on. I said, Ernie, this isn't working. Let's go to your house. And we had a lovely time, and I was gathering good information for what was going to be an As Told To book by Ernie Banks with Ron Rapoport in his voice, first person. And then after a while, I had a publisher lined up. They were really fascinating. Local publisher in Chicago. They were interested. They were ready to offer us pretty good money for a book like this because Ernie was so important in Chicago. Well, then I said, Ernie, we need to sign this contract. He said, we'll call my lawyer. The lawyer never got back to me. Our conversations faded. I realized it just wasn't going to happen. I felt bad about it. A year later, he called out of the blue and said, how about the book? I said, we started again. I went back to the publisher. He said, sure, let's do it. Ernie and I had more conversations. I'm getting good information. Stuff that ended up appearing in What's Play Too. And then the same thing happened. It's just sort of drifted. And I felt bad about it. The book that got away, I called it, because I could see that beneath the veneer, beneath Ernie being Ernie, there was a real guy. I was getting good information about it. When Ernie died, I kind of exorcised all of my disappointment. A, at the book that didn't work, and B, at what I had learned about the real Ernie inside. Ernie being Ernie. I wrote an article about it just to get it out of my system. What it had been like working with him, what I had learned about the real Ernie. And I wrote it I had only one magazine in mind, and that was Chicago Magazine, because it was a Chicago story. Well, they said sure, and they ran 4,000 words. I was happy with it. Okay, I'm done now. That's it. I've got Ernie out of my system. Well, all of a sudden, I started getting response to the article. Wow, we didn't know this about Ernie. We didn't know, basically, that there was a real boy, a real guy like Tokyo.
Right.
Inside, the guy who had been around Chicago for 60 years as a player, as a coach, as a man about town, as Ernie. He was part of Chicago's lifeblood, you know, after playing. He worked at a bank in Chicago. He had other jobs in Chicago. Even though he was living in California now, he kept coming back to Chicago. And in fact, he spent the last 7 years of his life there after he had split up with his fourth wife, moved back to Chicago. So people responded to that. They said, well, that's nice. I'm glad other people could respond to how I felt. Now I'm going to tell you a story about publishing.
Quickly, I want to just stop you just for one sec about what we're talking about. It's so keen how you saw, you know, at those Cub conventions, Ron, that you saw these insecurities about Banks. Am I using the right word? You saw that.
Absolutely the right word. We saw a guy who wasn't always happy, who wasn't always on, who had problems, like all of us do.
Exactly.
And what I realized was that Ernie was wearing a mask. And for 60 years in Chicago, all we ever really saw was the mask.
The man did not like controversy, correct?
No, that's correct. That's the one thing about Ernie. Anyway, a sports writer friend of mine, publisher called a sports writer friend of mine, do you know Ron Rapoport? I said, yeah. The next thing I know, I'm getting a call saying, you should write a biography. Oh, I said. You mean going back to Dallas and finding his family and talking about growing up there and then talking about his Cub days and talking about the rest of his life? I said, that's a big job. Well, he got a big publisher in New York really interested in it. We had a deal within a month. So now I'm on the road. I'm at Dallas, where I was able to find five, count them, five of his high school classmates. I was able to find, Ernie was the second of 12 children. I was able to find his older sister, Edna, who I think is still with us. She might be in her mid-90s by now. I haven't heard that she died. I was able to go on a sort of a voyage of discovery. Talk to many of the Cubs from '69. Billy Williams was sort of the den mother of all the '69 Cubs, who were always in demand to tell the story. So he put me in touch with Randy Hundley and Ron
Sano. Was it Ron Sano?
Sano, sorry, with shortstop. You got to help me.
Kessinger.
Kessinger was living in
Kessinger, yeah.
I'm talking to one after another. And the one thing I learned is that everybody who knew Ernie really well, from his days as a child in Dallas to his days with the Cubs, to his days afterwards, to people who knew him well when he got older, some of them very old. Everybody, and I was able to talk to many of them over Hunt. I'll tell you more. Everybody who I said, tell me about the real Ernie, all had a story. All of his friends, all of his associates, all of his relatives knew this about Ernie. And so as I'm writing the book, as I'm discovering the real Ernie Banks, the question that came in mind, I was actually did a conference at the Los Angeles Times Book Fair and Book Festival, the legendary athletes,
right,
or legendary African Americans. I'm sitting with a guy to my left who wrote a book about Frederick Douglass, the guy to my right who wrote a book about Alan Locke, who was one of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance. A guy farther down who's written a scholarly book on Arthur Ashe. And the question came up, what's the most amazing thing that you learned about the subject? And they all had reasons. And I said, how he got away with it. How Ernie got away without us realizing who he really was. And there was one person who knew him well late in life. And I promised I wouldn't say his name, and I won't. But he summed up Ernie very well. He said Ernie was a tortured soul. He just hid it very well.
Hid it very well.
The essence of Ernie Banks. What you said about conflict is absolutely right. That's the one thing you have to know about. Whenever he saw trouble coming, he ran the other way. In high school, his friends called him Casper.
Casper, the ghost. Yeah.
Because whenever there was something going on, Ernie was gone. He was the ghost. Whenever there was controversy, Ernie stayed away. Whenever there was trouble, Ernie didn't get in the middle of it. He never, ever got into an argument. He never, ever had any kinds of expression of unhappiness. And that was Ernie. He was hiding it all behind this mask.
The mask.
Being Ernie mask. The real Ernie Banks was hidden. And that's what I tried to discover and present in Let's Play.
You know, Ron, I have to tell you, of course, in the book, this great book, and again, I want to hold it up to our audience, Let's Play 2 by Ron Rapoport, a fantastic read that I know has been out since 2019, but is still out there to buy. It's just a fantastic read. I have to tell you, the mentions that, of course, it was well documented that that DeRocher, when he came here in '66, did not want Banks anymore. But DeRocher would try to get under Ernie's skin. And Ernie wasn't, like you're saying, that Reggie Jackson type that was going to combat him. He just sat down, took whatever Leo's side remarks were, and went on about his business, correct?
Well, that's exactly correct. And Leo made Ernie's life miserable. He was always trying to replace him. Fergie Jenkins said to me, every year there would be another guy at first base, and he started naming them. 1, 2, Don Bacabella, Lee
At the Montreal Expo.
This guy, this guy, this guy, this guy. He said there were 5 of them. Well, I looked it up. There were 7 or 8 or 9
Sure.
every year, and every year Ernie would win the job back. He would call him Gramps. He would call him old man. He would at the worst of it, John. He would call him out in the clubhouse. You can't hold anybody on base. You can't do this. You can't. And Ernie was a very good second baseman, not a first baseman. Now he was slow. After people know him as a shortstop.
Shortstop.
He played more games at first base. He would hold him up to ridicule in front of the team, and his teammates were squirming. They adored her. They loved her. And what they realized, and what Ernie realized, was that Leo was using Ernie as an example of what could happen to the other players. If he can do this to Ernie Banks, what can he do to me? The upshot was, we'll go back to Leo, but the upshot was that Ernie never, to his dying day, said anything bad about Leo. He said, oh, Leo was just trying to light a fire under me. I'm trying to give me a kick in the pants. I was getting older. I needed somebody to do this, to do that. Now, to treat me the way Leo did. Ernie never, ever complained in public. To his teammates, he said plenty. He said a lot. But the way Leo treated Ernie was scandalous. It was awful. And all Ernie did as an old man, baseball player, years, 35, 36, 37, 38, was play terrific baseball.
Terrific baseball.
Here's the essence of it, John. 1969, Ernie Banks, and never mind everything else that had gone on, because all we concentrate on is the wonderful 5 months and then the terrible months. So Ernie gets lost, and that's true of a lot of his career, gets lost his wonderful production. In 1969, Ernie Banks, who was 38 years old, drove in 102.
Unbelievable.
It was until the era of the designated hitter. It was the most ever by a 38-year-old man. Babe Ruth had 102. Ty Cobb had 101. Willie Mays had 55. He drove in 102 runs. That's a pretty good season.
And hit 23 home runs that year.
Yeah. All we remember about 1969 was the horror of it.
Right. That September we'll never forget for sure. But you're right. For that age and how he played first base, incredible. I thought he was such a slick fielding first baseman. And again, while
his range wasn't as good anymore.
Right.
And Leo used to get on him for not holding runners on, because he couldn't, he had to move over a little bit. He couldn't stand at first base and then quickly move over, because Ernie was slowing down over to another spot in the infield. Leo was always finding fault with Ernie, and he said it in the press. He would rip him in front of writers, he would rip him in press conference. Ernie would just sit there and take it. And you wondered why he didn't say something to somebody. Say, that's enough, get it out of my face. Why didn't he go in and see it privately? Leo, this isn't right. It was all part of Ernie's lifelong habit of avoiding controversy,
Ron, there's in the 1971 season, you capture it, what you're saying now. It was the tail end of Ernie's, of course, the last year of Ernie as a Cub playing. There was runners on first and third. It was his turn to bat, bottom of the ninth. I think it was a road game, so top of the ninth. And DeRocher called them back to the dugout and put Jim Hickman in to pinch hit for him. Nothing against Jimmy Hickman, but Hickman even says that was the hardest thing for him to do, to replace Ernie Banks. But the point of what I'm trying to make now is Banks, in what you wrote, went back to the dugout and sat next to DeRocher, where you would be like, if somebody else, he's throwing a bat, walking at the other end of the dugout and probably going to the clubhouse. You depicted Banks right there. I had water in my eyes just to read it 52 years later.
It drove me nuts. Leo was an amazing character, and I have a lot about Leo. I talked to a lot of people who knew Leo really well. He was the most charming man you ever met. He could charm the birds out of the trees. The story I love to tell is that he meets Lorraine Day, who later, the actress, who later ends up marrying, and they have this. She starts writing books and stuff. She's very much a figure around Chicago. He meets her as they're sitting at an airport waiting to board a plane. And when she first starts talking to him, she's put off by him. It's all Leo all the time. It's always that. She's not at all impressed by Ernie Banks. Leo, unbeknownst to her, goes to the whoever's running the flight and arranges to sit next to her. It's across. Maybe it's from New York to Los Angeles. Say it's all on flight. At the end of the flight, she's ready to marry him. He could charm the birds out of the trees. He was remarkable. His time in Los Angeles was really interesting. He was Walt Alston's coach. And
Their
trying
base
to
coach,
do
yeah.
Alston's job, and Alston didn't care. But while he was here, he was going on television shows. He was going on Mr. Ed. He was going on Dinah Shore. He was in shows where like sitcoms.
He was on the Munsters.
Where he would play himself, and he would go on with Dinah Shore and Judy Garland on their own shows. And he was charming. He was amazing. I tell people, go to YouTube and search for Judy Garland and Leo DeRocher. And you will find Judy had a show. And Leo comes on and sits and talks to her. And Judy was kind of fidgety and just kind of not quite there, just kind of nervous. And Leo was sitting back and talking to her and having a great time. The Leo everybody knew. And finally, at one point, Judy says, "Let's sing a song together." Leo says, "Well, I only know one song." And together, Judy Garland and Leo DeRocher and Mrs. Price will sing me out to the ball game. It's a wonderful clip. But Leo was amazing with people. I had an experience with him, which I didn't do, where he could just charm you. The flip side is he was a menace. He was a terrible guy. He was mean to women. He was mean to his ball players. He thought only about himself. The great moment in 1969 where he runs away from the team and lies and goes to a camp where his wife's son, his new wife's son was doing something in the camp, and he flew away and doing it in the middle of the pennant race. My God, how could he? Well, it was a huge story. They were yelling at him that he should, to Bill Ridley, that they should fire him. No. Leo could get away with anything. He was a terrible guy. He was this Jekyll and Hyde, this wonderful, charming, lovely fellow, full of stories and full of laughs and so on, and this terrible person. And I maintain, we're off the subject there a little bit.
But I have to tell you, Ron, you bring it out in the book of the Let's Play 2, where he, of course, we talked about how he didn't like Ernie, and he didn't like the famous announcer, of course, Jack Brickhouse, because they had their tit for tat where he thought that Brickhouse was trying to overmine him and things like that. But it was really Leo who wanted like you bring out in the book, the popularity. He wanted to be the main guy in Chicago.
Well, there were two very popular people in Chicago, Ernie Banks and Jack Brickhouse. And Ernie was Mr. Cub, and Ernie said that Leo thought, Ernie would say in his private moments, never public, that Leo wanted to be Mr. Cub. And of course, Brickhouse was very popular, and Leo couldn't stand it. He needed to be the guy, quotes. The guy. That was Leo's problem. And the fact that Ernie, who had been there for many years, and Jack, who had been there for many years, were so popular in Chicago, drove Leo crazy. There's one more thing I want to say. Leo DeRocher was a terrible manager. He was a terrible manager. He managed for 26 years. He won 3 pennants and 1 World Series. He won. He sparked. He was part of the greatest comeback of all time, the 54.
51, yep.
51 Giants, Bobby Thompson, and the worst flop of all time. And I believe, and the players will tell you that he ran them ragged in 1969. Ferguson Jenkins started 41 games. 41 games. The most since Iron Man McGinney, 50 years ago. He didn't, Phil Regan was the only guy he trusted out of the bullpen.
Exactly.
Regan at one point relieves in 7 straight games. That's a record for pitchers appearing in 7 straight games. Finally, Fergie pitches a complete game, and Regan walks up to shake his hand. Like, thank you for not letting me set that record. I needed a day's rest. But here's the story I like to tell. The Mets in 1969 had a backup catcher named J.C. Martin. And he was from Chicago. And, you know, he wins the pennant. Well, the next year he gets traded to the Cubs and he gets this is great. Not only am I going home, I'm going to a great team that almost won the pennant. That was a great, great team. They're all still there. Fergie and Heltzman and Billy and Ernie.
Sure.
They're all still there. He gets there, and after a couple of weeks, he realizes that they're never going to win because Leo is constantly stirring up trouble, stirring up dissension, this guy against this guy. And J.C. Martin said, and this is the best thing I've ever heard said about 1969. If Gil Hodges had managed the Cubs instead of the Mets in 1969, the Cubs would have won the pennant.
It's in that book, and I have to tell you, you wrote in the book about that J.C. Martin incident. And I have to tell you, Ron, when I go back to look, and I was 10 years old in 69, when you go back and look at it, Hodges strategically got those New York Mets to believe their slogan, and he strategically picked DeRocher and the Cubs apart in those series.
Everything came together for them. They played magnificent games, the Black Cat game, the Don Young game. I mean, I spent a lot of time on 1969, and it seemed like every single game between the Mets and the Cubs in New York and in Chicago was epic.
Significant, I mean, yes.
Tom Seaver comes within an out or two of pitching a perfect game. And a guy named Jim Qualls, who the heck?
A utility outfielder.
Gets a hit.
Incredible. But
Ron, that was in New York. Now they're playing in Chicago a little while later, and Seaver searches out Mets and says, you kept me from a perfect game. I mean, every game they played that year was
you said it was epic. Ron, I have to tell you, I interviewed Rich Nye, and Rich Nye brought it up just like you just did. That game in New York when Don Young dropped Don Clendenin's fly ball and then a short one in short center field. DeRocher and Ron Santo went off on Young in a way that was, unapproachable.
Broke his spirit. It was terrible. It was terrible. And here's the thing. Santo finally apologized. But what I'm wondering is, do all of the 1969 trauma, where was Ernie? Where was Mr. Collins? Why couldn't he say something to pull them together? Why couldn't he do something to say, we're going to win this in spite? Why? He was the clubhouse leader, was not the clubhouse leader. He was a leader with his bat. He was a leader with his glove. He was a leader with his presence. But he couldn't bring himself to become a leader in the clubhouse. It just wasn't in his nature. And John, I just wonder, could Ernie have brought them together? Could Ernie have said, we're going to do this in spite of Leo? Could he have said something, but it would have been against everything that he ever did in his whole career, and indeed in his whole life? He just ran away from trouble.
That's a great point by you, because we had the people who didn't know him, he had this calming approach. I wonder now, listening to you, if he would have been able to with his calm approach. I have to tell you, you brought up something great in the book that I didn't know about him. When they had the civil rights movement, and Henry Aaron went to him and Willie Mays and says, Ernie, Willie, our voices need to be heard. And they both, you say it perfectly, they shied away from it, right? Correct, Ronnie?
Did. Willie did, and Ernie did. And Ernie just stayed away. And this was 68, 69, things happened.
Sure.
And the rest of it. This is when civil rights was a big deal. There were protests there. But Ernie wouldn't say anything, would never say anything. And in fact, he got into trouble among the more militant black elements. We say Ernie Banks, he's all but calling him an Uncle Tom. And it hurt him. It hurt him. And later in life, he gave an interview to a friend of mine, Steve Jacobson, where he said, I wish I'd been more vocal. But again, Ernie just didn't get involved in controversy. It wasn't his thing. I've got to tell you, though, John, that one of the people I interviewed with had a really interesting talk with, and I talk at some length about in the book, was Jesse Jackson. And he said, yes, he wasn't there speaking out, but his presence was there. He was the first black Cub. he gave people who cared about baseball an entree into a well-spoken, friendly guy. I got an email after the book came. I think I might have put it in the paperback from a guy in the Northwest Side who said he'd been 9 years old. White guy, lived in a white neighborhood. Chicago was then and is now a very segregated city. Never came in contact with any black people. But he said he would come home from school and see Jack Brickhouse interviewing Ernie Banks, and Ernie being so nice and friendly and so on. And then at the end, Jack shaking Ernie's hand. Said it had a big effect on him. So Jesse Jackson said, Ernie's presence spoke something, spoke a lot. Some people do, and some people talk. And then he said the most interesting thing of all. We knew Ernie Banks before we knew Martin Luther King. That was Jesse Jackson's.
Sure.
So Ernie did do something, even though he didn't speak out. He stood for something. He meant something. So you got to give him that.
Oh, yeah. Ron, I have to ask you before I go on to one other question. I always wanted to know this, and I think you have the answer for me. Was Ernie's relationship with Jack Brickhouse as genuine as we see it in those 10th inning shows and those interviews?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, Jack.
I felt like Jack loved him. Jack loved him.
Jack did love him, and that came through. And Ernie loved being on TV, and Ernie was very well spoken, and he gave the Ernie being Ernie stuff, which is what the fans wanted to hear and wanted to hear him say. And he I think he and Jack got along just fine. I never came across any instance or anybody saying that they didn't get along.
You know, you could hear Brickhouse in his voice when Ernie would come to bat here in Chicago on those games on WGN, and he had men on base and there were 2 out. And you could just hear it in Brickhouse's voice when he would go, come on, Ernie, you know, come on. He's facing Gibson, and Gibson's throwing 100 miles an hour. You know? How were those later years with Banks? As I read where, you know, the later years were really kind of lonely.
They were trouble. No, they were trouble. There's no question about it. Here's the basic problem, John. Ernie Banks made, adjusted for inflation, his entire career about $8 billion. Now, Mike Trout, Shohei Ohtani make that per game.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a different era. So he comes out of baseball. He's done now, and he's not a wealthy guy, and he's not trained to do anything. I list a number of these jobs that he had in the book. He might have had 50 different jobs. He worked in a bank. He worked for a moving company. He worked for this. He owned a car, the first black man to own a car agency, Ford agency. None of the jobs lasted. Ernie had ADD, I'm convinced. People have said that. He didn't have the stick-to-itiveness. He'd never been trained for anything. So making money was always a problem, was always a concern. And what they finally discovered was, I believe that the only thing Ernie could do that nobody else could do was be Ernie. Go to conventions, make speeches, do this, do that. However, they would set him up for speeches that paid a certain amount of money. Or people would come to him, will you come to this? And Ernie would say, sure, and then he wouldn't come. And there'd be a ballroom full of people, and there would be no Ernie.
No Ernie Banks.
He lost some credibility there.
Sure.
So he was always traveling. He was always playing golf. He was always doing this. He was always looking for a way to make some money. And later on, when he got sick, he also had women trouble. He had 4 wives. He never divorced Liz, his 4th one. And there was this terrible dispute over his will with a woman, a friend of his who had taken care of Regina Rice. Nice lady who I talked to.
Sure.
And had a lot, she gave me a lot of information about her in his late years, as did some other people. But this fight has just been, in the last couple of months, been settled, where Regina got control of, it hasn't been control, basically all he has left is his memorabilia. Regina has control of that. I think Liz got some rights to something. They didn't reveal everything. But thank God, after all these years, that's over now. But he had, his second wife was Alois, who was the mother of his children. That was ended in a terrible divorce. His third wife was Marjorie Lott, who he met at the CTA. No one was able to interview out here. She's living in the desert.
Okay.
And that ended terribly. Each of the wedding marriages ended terribly, including the fourth one, although there was never a divorce. He left her in Los Angeles, moved to Chicago, where I must say, the Ricketts took very good care of him. He lived in Trump Tower, you know.
Because I was going to ask, how could he have afforded Trump
He
Tower?
lived in Trump Tower. The Cubs paid for it. The Cubs put him on salary, and now they had somebody to watch him and take care of it. If you want to, Mr. Banks, speak at your event, you got to go through these women who took good care of him. And I talked to them, and they explained it to me. So, and he had an office in the Wrigley Building. There was a friend of his who ran the Wrigley Building. Name I forget, but he's in the book. Nice guy. Had an office there. And there was a barber down on Walton Place, a Russian guy who I talked to. Ernie would hang out there. And he was a fixture at Harry Carey.
Yes.
You'd go in there and he'd be by himself and people would come up and talk to him. I once did talk to him for a while and I walked out. This was kind of sad. I walked out after I had some lunch with some people. They went, I saw Ernie sitting alone. We sat and talked. I walked out and the hostess said, "Thank you for taking care of it." It was kind of a sad picture of the guy's last 7 years. Well, then, when he died, it was another. Regina and some other people were able to tell me minute by minute, hour by hour, his last days. And it was kind of sad, very sad. Collapsing in his apartment. The ambulance taking him. You know, the doctor saying, "I don't think they're going to be able to save him." Okay, now he's dead. They have an amazing at the Fourth Press, you know,
Sure.
you know, incredible funeral. Both Regina and Liz are there, and there's this tension going on. The whole world, you know, Joe Torre spoke, and Karen was there. So now there's this amazing my funeral cortege from the church all the way to Graceland Cemetery.
Wow.
Very, I mean, and then there was one last goodbye. So that's his later years were difficult because A, he didn't have the kind of money that
Sure.
great ball players get enough to live on, and B, he was at loose ends. There was nothing for him really there.
Yeah.
And because he wasn't smart enough to arrange things, or he wasn't reliable enough to
Reliable to, yeah. There was a
It's kind of a
loneliness.
sad thing to say, but he kept coming back to Chicago. He was always at the Cubs convention where I got to see him, and he was always around at games. And
Sure.
people waving to him and so on. There was a story I tell near the end of the book where he's in the. There were a couple of women who became really friendly with him, and they would meet him in the box where he sat. And I was able to talk to both of them. They were great about what it was like to be friendly with Ernie. And, they had some experiences with him. They would sit with him, and so one of them, he sees one of the women they're talking, and one of them's on the cell phone. And he says, "Who are you talking to?" And she says, "I'm talking to a friend of mine. She's in center field at Yankee Stadium at Derek Jeter's last game." Oh, Ernie says, "Let me talk to her." Okay, so Ernie's talking to this woman in Yankee Stadium. I don't know how they heard each other. He could hear her, how she could hear him with all the craziness.
With all the noise going on, sure.
And she says, "I'm at Derek Jeter's last game." And Ernie, I don't know whether you remember, but at the whole year of the celebration of Jeter's retirement, Nike puts out a commercial with Derek going here in New York and Derek going there in New York, Derek getting on the subway, Derek, New York, New York, New York.
Right.
And underneath of it, underneath the soundtrack is Frank Sinatra singing My Way. I did it my way.
My way, yeah.
So Ernie and everybody in the world had seen that commercial. So now here's Ernie talking to this woman at center field in the Yankee Stadium. And they're talking for a while. And all of a sudden, Ernie starts singing My Way, making the connection. He had seen the commercial 100 times, Jeter. He sings the whole song. Regrets I have a few, but then again, too few to mention. It's marvelous moment.
What a timing, right? At that timing. All right, I'm going to ask you one question before and then we're going to do a little fun thing, me and you.
All right.
He was most valuable player in 58 and 59. Of course, hit 512 home runs.
Yeah.
Was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame.
First ballot.
First ballot,
He was
1977,
the first-
when you came
he was
to
the first, There are a
Chicago.
number of them now, but he was the first
Yeah.
ballot Hall of Famer never to play in World Series.
And of course,
Ken Griffey and Rutger who came along.
right, and of course, the 1969 season, which I mean, as much as we know was a sad moment, but of all those moments, what do you think was Ernie Banks's proudest moment?
It's a very good question. I'd have to say that there was one early in his career where he's coming up to bat, and they announce that he's made the All-Star team. His second year or third year, first time All-Star team. Cheers, cheers, cheers. Ernie hits a home run. He's standing at the plate when they announce it, and he hits a home run.
Wow, that's a great.
I guess, I mean, he had so many great moments. You talk about the two back-to-back MVPs. You know, in 59, he's going for his second MVP. And the town is on fire with baseball fever for the White Sox, who are going to the World Series.
World Series.
The Cubs. And I'm sorry to say, nobody cares about Ernie Banks, and I'll give you an example. He hits his 43rd home run, I believe, in his late September. And his second straight coming up MVP season. John, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but there were 900 people.
Wow.
Not 9,000. I think it was the smallest crowd in Wrigley Field.
Jeez.
That was the atmosphere in which Ernie played. So I think the proudest moment of his career was making the Hall of Fame. That really meant something because he was older now. And if you look at the clip, it's on YouTube. He looked wonderful. He was, he said, "Let's play two." He said all the right things. He said,
Yeah.
Wrigley and all of this and all of that. It was a
Wonderful ceremony.
Really worth seeking. I would say among the highlights.
For sure. Well, listen, let's have a little fun before we close it off. You said you were from, you were basically a Detroit Tiger fan, correct?
Was.
Yeah. Question, who was, I got 5 questions for you, 1-word answers so you can elaborate. Favorite Detroit, your favorite Detroit Tiger of all time?
Well, Kaline.
Okay, Kaline.
What else you got?
Okay.
I will tell you that I'm reading the papers. I remember his rookie year.
Sure.
18, had never played in the minor. Came straight out of high school and was wonderful then. It was marvelous. Yeah.
Does Rocky Colavito deserve to be in the Hall of Fame as teammate?
No.
Okay. Just wanted to ask you that.
You know, there are Hall of Famers. There are for sure Hall of Famers, first ballot Hall of Famers. And then there are Hall of Famers that are really good. And then there are Hall of Famers that is marginal, you could argue.
Right.
You could argue. There's Bill Buckner, 27, Fada Pinson, really great players.
Great players.
And their teammates will fight for them to be in, But everybody has their own view. And mine is mine is fairly elastic. But I know some people who think, no, you got to be Joe.
Yeah,
you
but
got to be really, really good.
That was and of course Al Kaline, what a player. Second question. A person, Ron, that you'd like to interview that you didn't or is still around and you haven't interviewed him yet, and it can't be me.
I never got a chance to interview Tiger Woods. And early in his career, I don't care about, now it's different. We know it. But early in his career, he was so fabulous. I thought he would have been a great interview. On the other hand, I got to tell you that I've got a one-up on just about everybody. I interviewed Jackie Robinson. So that makes up for that interview.
Great. Number 3, of all the books, articles that you've written, what was that one article where you said, wow, you know, Ron Rapoport has arrived. I got this. It's the one that you go back to and you say, this is the one.
Tough, real tough. I think there were some columns in Chicago that I was proud of. I think I did a Walter Payton column for the Sporting News that I liked.
Right.
That they liked. I've done some things over the years that I've been proud of. I've done some things where I've said, well, we'll get them tomorrow. But I will have to tell you that my experience with Robinson was important to me. It was 4 months before he died, and it was in a dark hotel room in Los Angeles. The lights off because he was nearly blind.
Sure.
The light hurts my eyes, that kind of thing. And he railed against baseball. Jackie never made peace with baseball. There had no black managers. The Dodgers treated me terribly, and this and that and the other. And I'm sitting there thinking, Jackie Robinson and me, pretty good.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Your favorite Chicago restaurant when you were here all the time, your go-to, what was it?
Well, we used to go to Ricardo's a lot back when the Sun Times was where Trump Tower is now. That was a place. I like Shaw's Crab House,
Okay.
which was nearby, and which I was back in Chicago 3 or 4 years ago. Glad to see that they haven't changed a thing. I'm not even sure it's up before. I would go to Billy Goat for fun for a beer.
Very nice.
They were. Oh, I'll tell you what. My favorite pizza was Eduardo.
Eduardo's, that was,
My family enjoyed Eduardo. We lived in Evanston, and they had one there.
yeah, they had an Eduardo's there. Yes.
They would make us a spinach and pepperoni pizza.
Oh, yeah.
Makes me
Yeah, that
hungry.
was a great chain. That was a great chain.
Makes
All
me
right.
hungry.
So this is my last one, and then I'll close it off for you. Just be honest with me, because I started out Cubs, of course, because we're talking about Ernie, and then I kind of changed because I couldn't wait anymore. And so who was your favorite team in town, even though you wrote the book about the one and only Cubs or Sox?
Oh, Cubs or Sox?
When you were here in
I got to choose
Chicago.
between one of those. I can't say Bulls.
I guess you can.
You said favorite team in town.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed covering both teams. Listen, when you're a writer, when you're writing it, you're not approaching it as a fan. As a fan, my feeling is you're sitting back, you're like this. Right? You have a beer, you're talking to your friend. What happened to that thing? When you're a writer, you're like this. You're sitting forward. This is all material. This isn't a game. This is what I do for a living.
Right.
How am I going to do? Am I going to put that in the paper? Am I going to put that in the paper? You're watching it from a completely different perspective. And both teams from that perspective. Southside Hitmen, you know, and
For sure.
what year did they go to San Diego and lose? Whatever year that, 84. That Cubs team was fascinating. Those teams were endlessly fascinating. They had fascinating characters, fascinating players to talk about. I mean, who was more fun to talk to than Ozzie Guillen? The young Ozzie Guillen.
The young guy.
Yeah. I remember to this day, Johnny Morris interviewing him and asking him to pronounce his name because we didn't know who Ozzie Guillen was. Things like that.
Sure.
Trivial things to come in.
Well, I have to tell you, I truly thank you for coming on here today. I thought we scratched the surface, but I would love to do a part 2 with you, even about other things that you've done. But I want to read something to you. We have a friend in common. I was a hockey coach here in Illinois for many years, and he was also a sports columnist, and he says something really nice about you in this book. And when I saw that we had this man in common, a great guy, he writes about you. The bio of Ernie Banks is a must read. Let's Play 2 by Ron Rapoport is beautifully written. The book that captures the good and the bad, the happy and the sad of Ernie's life. Cub fans of certain age will love this book. I give it my highest recommendation. That's good because it's Ron Rapoport. And we're speaking of Bruce Miles from the Daily Herald, who really, truly, Ron, thinks highly of you. And I am honored to have had this chance to talk to you today, sir.
It's been good, John. You're a good interview. It's worked well. You got me talking.
Okay. Well, let's do it. How about maybe in the beginning of the fall, we do a part 2 on something else?
Absolutely.
I got it. Ron Rapoport, Thank you so much. And we will get this out to you so we can see more about Ron.
Thanks, Sean. Pleasure being here.
Good afternoon. Thank you.